The gymnasium smelled like floor wax and burnt coffee. Daniel Reeves was on his knees near the stage, working a rag over a scuff mark, when the CEO of Coulson Manufacturing walked past him in heels that clicked like a countdown. "Careful," Vivian Coulson said, not glancing down. "Some of us actually have somewhere to be tonight." A few parents near the punch bowl laughed. Daniel said nothing. His hand tightened on the rag until his knuckles went white, and he kept working the same slow circle while she walked toward the stage lights without looking back. If you've ever been looked past by someone who had no idea who you really were, drop a comment below. Let's see how many of you have been there. The porch light was out again by the time Daniel got home, and he didn't bother fixing it. He sat on the step in the dark a while, listening to crickets, letting the sting from the gymnasium settle into something quieter before he went inside. Ellie was already asleep, a whale-shaped nightlight glowing on her dresser. He stood in her doorway a long moment watching her breathe, then went to the kitchen and ate cereal standing over the sink because cooking for one still didn't feel worth the effort. Even 2 years on, he had been a structural engineer once. Bridges, an overpass outside Kalamazoo, a stadium roof renovation in Grand Rapids that still carried his calculations in a drawer at a firm that no longer remembered his name. He didn't talk about that life, not to the other custodians, not to Ellie's teachers, not even to Ellie, who believed her father had always pushed a mop for a living and loved him exactly as much either way. There had been a version of himself once who wore a hard hat and signed off on load tolerances that kept strangers safe 50 feet in the air. That man had quietly disappeared the same autumn his wife did, and Daniel had never much felt the need to bring him back. He checked on Ellie one more time before bed, adjusted the blanket that had slid to the floor, and told himself, the way he told himself most nights, that a stranger's cruelty in a gymnasium didn't matter half as much as whether his daughter had brushed her teeth. His wife, Marie, had been the one who kept the old blueprints, the framed photo of the stadium roof going up beam by beam, the certificate from the engineering board. After the accident that took her, he'd boxed most of it up and put it in the crawl space above the garage, telling himself it was temporary, the way a man tells himself a lot of things are temporary, right after his whole life stops being one. 2 years later, the boxes were still up there, and the crawl space door still stuck the same way it always had, and he still hadn't found a reason good enough to climb back up and open them. He worked the early shift at the school because it let him be home for Ellie's bus in the afternoon, and he liked the quiet of empty hallways before the building filled with noise, and the particular hush of a gym floor before anyone had walked across it yet. It wasn't the life he'd planned. He'd stopped minding that most days. Tonight wasn't quite most days. Across town, in an office on the top floor of a building with the family name carved into the lobby marble, Vivian was still at her desk past 9. Preston Cade stood across from her, arms crossed, tie loosened just enough to look like a man who'd worked hard rather than one who'd simply been waiting. "The board wants the Ashland plant sold by end of quarter," he said. "Your father would have signed off on it in an afternoon." "My father built that plant with his own hands," Vivian said, not looking up from the spreadsheet glowing on her screen. "He wouldn't have signed anything in an afternoon, and you know it." Preston smiled the way men like him always smiled, when they were losing an argument they didn't believe they could lose. "Your father can't tell us what he would have done anymore, Vivian. That's rather the problem, isn't it?" She didn't answer. She thought instead of her father's face, slack on one side now, eyes still sharp even when his mouth couldn't keep pace with them. She closed the spreadsheet, told Preston the conversation was over for the night, and drove out to Maple Ridge Care Center the way she did most evenings, past the shuttered downtown storefronts that still carried her family's name on tarnished brass plaques nobody had bothered to remove. She had taken over as chief executive 14 months earlier, the week after her father's stroke, with no transition plan and no real preparation beyond a childhood spent overhearing boardroom arguments through a cracked office door. She'd learned the job the way a person learns to swim, by being pushed into deep water, and most nights she still felt like she was treading it rather than actually swimming. The comment at the fundraiser wasn't the first careless thing she'd said under that particular kind of pressure. It was, she was beginning to suspect, simply the first one that had followed her home. A television played a nature documentary neither of them was watching. "I said something today I probably shouldn't have," she told her father. A janitor. At Ellie, at the elementary school fundraiser. "I don't even know why I said it. It just came out of me, like it was already sitting there waiting." Walter Coulson's eyes moved to hers and held, steady, listening the way he always had. even now that the words could no longer follow. His good hand twitched against the blanket, small and involuntary. She didn't think much of it at the time. She kissed his forehead, told the night nurse she'd be back Thursday, and drove home with the radio off, turning the evening over without finding anything useful in it. Rosalind Marsh had worked nights at Maple Ridge for 11 years, and she knew Walter Colson better than his own daughter did, as in the particular way people who sit with the dying and the fading come to know things no one else was ever meant to. She'd watched him that night after Vivian left, watched his jaw work like a man chewing on a sentence that refused to come loose, and she wondered, not for the first time, how much longer she could keep a promise made to someone who could no longer release her from it. The following week, with the estate finally cleared for her to begin, Vivian drove out to the old house to sort through her father's study. Dust sat thick on the shelves, undisturbed since his stroke. She worked through file boxes for the better part of an hour, mostly old ledgers and correspondence with the plant's original architects, before she found it tucked behind a stack of receipts in the bottom drawer of the desk, a single photograph, corners gone soft with age, no frame, no date on the back. Her father, younger, hair still mostly brown, standing outside a diner she didn't recognize, and he was laughing, not the tight, rehearsed smile from every company portrait and gala photograph she had ever seen of him. A real laugh, head tipped back, eyes crinkled shut. Beside him stood a man she'd never seen before, younger too, in a flannel jacket, one arm slung easily around her father's shoulders the way old friends stand for a camera, is not the way business acquaintances do. She sat with the photograph longer than she meant to, turning it over twice, looking for a name, a date, anything, and found only a faint smudge where someone's thumb had once held it too tightly for too long. Rosalind arrived not long after, dropping off a box of Walter's personal effects from the facility, and stopped cold in the study doorway when she saw what Vivian was holding. "Do you know who this is?" Vivian asked. Something moved behind Rosalind's eyes, quick, controlled, gone almost before it started. "I couldn't say," she said, and the careful flatness of her voice told Vivian more than the words themselves did. It wasn't until 3 days later, watching Daniel Reeves push a cart of cleaning supplies down the hallway outside the cafeteria, that the recognition hit her like a dropped plate. The set of the jaw, the particular way his shoulders squared when he thought no one was watching. 12 years older now, heavier in the face, tired in a way the man in the photograph hadn't yet learned to be, but it was him. The janitor she had humiliated in front of a gymnasium full of parents was the same man standing beside her father in the only photograph where Walter Colson had ever looked, unmistakably happy. She sat in her car in the school parking lot for 20 minutes without starting the engine, staring at nothing, turning over a question with no shape to it yet. What was a school custodian doing in the most guarded memory her father had kept? Who is this man? And why did her father never once mention him in 37 years? Sit with that question, because Vivian is about to spend the next several days trying to answer it, and it will cost her more than she expects. She went back to the school 2 days later, telling herself it was to apologize, though she suspected, somewhere underneath the reasoning, that it was really to look at his face again and try to understand what exactly she was looking at. She found Daniel in the hallway replacing a flickering fluorescent tube and stood there a beat too long before he noticed her. "Mr. Reeves." It came out stiffer than she intended. He glanced down, then back to the fixture. "Miss Colson, I wanted to apologize for what I said." It was she stopped, hearing how much worse every rehearsed sentence sounded out loud than it had in her head on the drive over. "It was cruel, and it wasn't true. And I'm sorry." He looked at her a moment, unreadable, then returned to the light. "Apology accepted," he said, in a tone that made it clear the wound was closed the way a door is closed without being locked. Was there something else? There wasn't. Not that she could say yet, so she shook her head and let him finish his work. He climbed down from the stepladder to gather his tools, and for a moment the two of them stood in the empty hallway with nothing left to say, and neither one quite ready to be the first to walk away. The overhead lights hummed. Somewhere down the corridor, a custodial cartwheel squeaked against the tile, and Daniel glanced toward the sound out of habit before looking back at her. "For what it's worth," he said, "most people who say something like that never bother coming back to apologize for it. Whatever else, I'll give you that much." Vivian didn't know what to do with the compliment, if it even was one, so she simply nodded and let it sit between them a moment before turning toward the door. She was halfway to the parking lot when quick, small footsteps came up behind her, and a girl of about 9 barreled past and threw both arms around Daniel's waist the moment he stepped outside. "Dad," Miss Ferris said, "we get to do the volcano project." Daniel crouched without hesitation, folding his daughter into a hug, laughing at some private joke only the two of them understood. Vivian stood at the edge of the lot and watched a kind of tenderness she rarely saw up close, unhurried, uncomplicated, without an audience in mind. She thought of every gala she had attended where fathers checked their phones through their own children's speeches, and she felt something come loose in her chest that she didn't yet have a name for. That night she couldn't stop thinking about the photograph, or the girl's face lit up like a struck match, or the plain, stubborn dignity of a man twice humiliated who had chosen, twice now, not to make her feel it. She began quietly asking questions of people who owed the family favors. A search through old employment archives turned up a name she hadn't expected. Daniel Reeves, listed for 6 years as a structural engineer at a firm in Grand Rapids, credited with a stadium renovation and 2 bridge retrofits, before the record simply stopped. No termination notice. No subsequent employer listed anywhere. Just silence. Beginning, she noted with a small cold feeling, the same year his wife's obituary had run in the local paper. Meanwhile, Preston Cade grew louder in the boardroom, framing every hesitation of Vivian's as sentiment getting in the way of sound business, working the same phrase into every conversation with the other board members in slightly different clothes each time. She isn't her father. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Vivian began to feel the ground shifting beneath her before she fully understood why, or how many of the board members had already quietly decided which way they would jump. She called an old colleague of Daniel's, a project manager named Frank Bishop, who had worked beside him on the Grand Rapids Stadium job, hoping to fill in the blank years the employment record couldn't explain. Bishop remembered him well, remembered him as sharp, exacting, the kind of engineer who double-checked a load calculation twice, even when the first pass had already been right. "Man just vanished on us," Bishop said over the phone. "One week he's running our safety review, the next his wife's funeral notice is in the paper, and he never came back. Nobody pushed him on it. Figured a man's entitled to disappear after something like that." Vivian thanked him and sat with the phone in her lap a long while afterward, turning the shape of a man's grief over in her hands, like she'd been handed something fragile she didn't know how to hold. She brought the photograph to Rosalind directly, no pretense this time, and asked her either to explain it or admit outright that she wouldn't. Rosalind was quiet a long while, weighing a promise against a debt she felt she owed the truth. "There are things your father wanted kept his own," she finally said. "I'd think hard before you go digging any further, Miss Coulson. Some doors, once opened, don't shut back the way they were." "I'm not asking you to betray him," Vivian said. "I'm asking you to help me understand him. He's still my father. I'd like to know who he actually was." Rosalind studied her for a long moment, then looked away, toward the window, toward nothing in particular. "Ask me again when you're ready to hear the answer," she said, and would say no more that night, no matter how Vivian pressed. It was 2 nights later, after a long shift and a harder visit than usual with Walter, his eyes wet, for no reason Rosalind could name, his hand reaching for hers with unusual insistence, that she finally broke. She found Vivian in the parking lot of the care center and told her the whole of it quickly, the way a person pulls a splinter before they can think better of it. 12 years earlier, Walter Coulson had collapsed at a roadside diner outside town, alone on a business trip, his heart stopping for nearly a full minute before a stranger at the next table dropped to his knees and began compressions without waiting for anyone's permission. That stranger was Daniel Reeves, then still an engineer, driving back from a job site 2 counties over. He stayed until the ambulance arrived, rode partway to the hospital because Walter's hand wouldn't let go of his sleeve, and then, once Walter was stable, quietly left before anyone thought to write down his name. Walter tracked him down 3 weeks later through the hospital's intake records, and the two of them had dinner exactly once, back at the same diner, where a waitress, or maybe Walter himself, with the disposable camera he kept in his glove box, for reasons he never explained to anyone, took the photograph Vivian had found in the drawer. "Your father changed after that," Rosalind said. "Not overnight. But the plant's safety record improved within 2 years. He started eating dinner with the line workers every year on the anniversary of his heart attack, right up until the stroke took even that from him. He never told anyone why. He just started being a different kind of man to run that company, and everyone assumed he'd simply mellowed with age. Why didn't he ever tell me? Any of it? Rosalind was quiet a moment, choosing her words the way a person chooses footing on ice. I think some men aren't built to talk about the day they almost died, she said. I think it embarrassed him a little, needing saving that badly, by a total stranger, on a diner floor with ketchup packets scattered around him. Pride's a strange thing in men like your father. It let him change everything about how he ran his company, but it wouldn't let him say the word grateful out loud to the one person who'd earned it most. And Daniel? Did he ever ask what happened to the man he saved? Did he even know who my father was? I believe he knew, Rosalind said. I believe he never once used it. Not for a job reference, not for a favor, not for anything at all. That's the part your father couldn't get over. If you want my honest opinion of it, he'd spent his whole life around men who wanted something the moment they found out who he was. Daniel never asked him for a single thing. Vivian sat in her car afterward and didn't start the engine for a long time, somewhere in the back of a family legacy she had inherited, without ever fully understanding its foundation. There had been a stranger's two hands keeping her father's heart beating on a diner floor, and she had spent the better part of a decade sneering at strangers exactly like him, without knowing which one she might already owe everything to. The photograph in the drawer had been taken the day her father got a second chance at his own life. No wonder he'd been laughing like that. It was the only unguarded laugh in the entire collection of family photographs, and now, finally, she understood why. Do you have a version of your parent you've never actually met, the one from before you? Or the one they never let you see? It's worth asking, while you still can. The following month, at a contentious board meeting called to finalize the Ashland plant sale, Preston Cade produced a folder he clearly believed would end the conversation for good. Medical records, pulled through channels he wouldn't specify, meant to argue that Walter Colson had not been of sound mind during his final competent year's evidence. Preston said that recent amendments to the family trust should be considered legally void. He read one clause aloud, meant to embarrass, meant to paint Walter as senile and Vivian as sentimental for humoring it, a standing, unactivated fund, quietly established 9 years earlier, earmarked in Walter's own handwritten note attached to the file, for the man who gave me back my life whenever he's found, and whenever he needs it, no questions asked. The room went still. Vivian felt her own pulse in her ears. Preston pressed forward, calling Rosalind in to testify to Walter's mental state at the time of the amendment, clearly expecting her to hedge, to protect her position, to say whatever came easiest. Instead, under questioning before the full board, Rosalind told the truth in its entirety: the diner, the collapse, the stranger, the photograph, the yearly dinners with the line workers, and watched Preston's face lose its color in real time as the weapon he'd built turned into something else in his hands. Vivian understood then what her father had been trying, in his slow and broken way, to say every time his good hand twitched against the blanket in that dim room. He had never stopped being grateful. He had simply never found the moment, or perhaps the courage, to say it to the one man it actually belonged to. Preston recovered enough to try one more angle, turning to the room with the practiced calm of a man used to winning by threat rather than argument. If this story got out a CEO playing favorites with a school custodian over some sentimental fund her declining father cooked up in a hospital bed, it would make Colson Manufacturing a punchline in every trade paper in the state, and Vivian along with it. He meant it exactly the way it sounded. Vivian stood. Her chair scraped the floor loud enough that the room went quiet on its own before she said a word. Then, let it get out, she said. Because it's true, and because it's the one decent thing my father did that I never gave him proper credit for. 12 years ago, a man named Daniel Reeves saved my father's life on a diner floor and asked for nothing in return. My father spent the rest of his working life trying to become someone worthy of that debt. I intend to honor this fund exactly as he wrote it, effective today, with or without this board's approval. Preston opened his mouth to answer. No one in the room backed him. One by one, board members who had spent the last 20 minutes nodding along to his warnings looked instead at Vivian, and something in the room tipped, quietly and completely, in her direction. An older board member named Harold Whitfield, who had sat beside Walter Colson in this same room for nearly 30 years, cleared his throat and spoke into the silence. I've known Walter since before any of you were hired, he said. I never once saw him take a personal risk on a business decision in his life. Whatever this fund is, if he put his own hand to writing it, It wasn't sentiment. It was the most serious thing he ever did in this building. He looked at Preston as he said it, and Preston, for the first time all meeting, had nothing to say back. The vote to strike down the trust amendment never even reached the floor. Preston withdrew the motion himself, a beat too late to make it look like his own idea. Daniel was asked to come in the following week, not told why. Only that it concerned his employment and a family matter he'd want to hear in person. He stood in a boardroom paneled in old walnut, still in his work boots, while a dozen people in tailored suits looked at him like he was something between a ghost and a miracle, and Vivian introduced him not as a custodian, not as an employee of the district, but as the reason her father had lived long enough to build half of what stood in that room. Daniel listened to the full account, the fund, the trust language, the sum attached to it, and then shook his head once, firm and unhurried. "I didn't do CPR, so somebody would owe me something," he said. "There was a man dying on the floor of a diner, and I knew how to help. I appreciate it. I don't need the money." Vivian watched him say it, and felt something in her chest rearrange itself. She had spent weeks looking at Daniel Reeves as a debt to be repaid, a wrong to be corrected, a mystery to be solved to its last detail. Watching him turn down money he could clearly have used, for reasons that had nothing to do with pride, and everything to do with some quiet code he simply lived by, she saw him instead as what he actually was: steadier, in his own unremarkable way, than anyone else in that room full of tailored suits. One of the board members pressed him, half curious, half testing. "Surely there's something the company could offer. Tuition for your daughter, a better position, something." Daniel thought about that longer than the question seemed to warrant. "There's one thing," he finally said, "whatever this fund turns into, make sure it goes to the people on that plant floor who never get asked what they actually need. Not me, them." Vivian rewrote the fund's charter herself that same afternoon, expanding it to cover exactly what Daniel had described, and told him about the change before she told the board, because she'd already begun to understand whose opinion she wanted to hear first. Preston, cornered and out of leverage, resigned from the board within the month rather than face a formal inquiry into where he'd sourced Walter's sealed medical file, and the Ashland plant sale was quietly withdrawn from the agenda for good. A week later, Ellie showed up at the Coulson offices with her father, waiting in the lobby while he finished a conversation about the fund's terms with the estate attorney, and she handed Vivian a folded piece of construction paper without being asked, the way children sometimes decide, entirely on their own terms, that someone belongs in their world. It was a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures standing in front of a house, Daniel, unmistakable with his mop, Ellie, shorter, in a purple dress, and a third figure with yellow hair, standing a little apart but clearly, deliberately, included. "That's you," Ellie said, matter of fact, pointing at the yellow-haired figure. "Are you Dad's friend?" Vivian knelt to her level, unsure how to answer a question that simple, with an answer that honest and that complicated. "I'd like to be," she said, and meant it more than she expected to when the words left her mouth. Daniel, watching from a few feet away, said nothing, but something in his shoulders loosened that had stayed tight since the night of the gymnasium. Ellie, delighted to have an audience, insisted on showing Vivian her volcano project in progress, a shoebox diorama with a papier-mâché cone still drying on the kitchen table. Vivian ended up staying an hour longer than she'd planned, helping paint tiny plastic trees while Ellie narrated the entire eruption sequence in exhaustive detail, and Daniel stood in the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee, watching the two of them argue cheerfully over whether the lava should be orange or red. Feeling something in his chest he hadn't let himself feel in longer than he could easily count. Later that week, Ellie's school held its fall open house, and Daniel was up on a ladder in the front hallway when a string of lights refused to cooperate, flickering and dying every few seconds no matter what he tried. Vivian, arriving early to drop off a check for the Parent Association, found him muttering at a tangle of wiring, and, without quite deciding to, stayed to hold the ladder steady. "You don't have to do that," he said, not looking down. "I know," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." They didn't talk about the fund, or the photograph, or her father. They talked about the stubbornness of old wiring, and Ellie's volcano project, and briefly, a bridge outside Kalamazoo that Daniel mentioned once and then didn't finish explaining. When the lights finally caught and held, he climbed down and thanked her, and for a moment neither of them moved to leave, standing together in a hallway strung with lights that neither of them had managed to fix alone. That evening, Vivian drove to Maple Ridge with the photograph in her bag and asked Daniel if he'd be willing to come with her. He hesitated only a moment before agreeing, and left Ellie for the hour with Rosalind's own daughter, who lived 2 streets over and had watched her more than once before. Walter's room was dim, the television murmuring low, the blinds half drawn against the last of the evening light. Vivian set the photograph on the blanket where her father could see it clearly, and told him plainly who had come with her tonight. Walter's eyes moved from the photograph to Daniel's face and held there, and for a long moment nothing in the room moved at all, not even the dust in the lamplight. Then his good hand rose, shaking, and found Daniel's, and gripped it the way a drowning man grips a rope thrown too late, but not too late. Daniel knelt beside the bed without being asked, and let the old man hold on as long as he needed to, tears sliding sideways into the pillow, from an eye that could still cry, even though the mouth beneath it could no longer say thank you the way it wanted to. "He's been trying to tell you something for 12 years, Vivian said quietly, and Daniel only nodded, throat working, and stayed until Walter's grip finally loosened into an exhausted, peaceful sleep. Out in the parking lot afterward, neither of them spoke for a while. The evening had gone cool, the kind of autumn night that turns breath visible without quite requiring a coat yet. Vivian leaned against her car and looked at Daniel across the hood. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know it wasn't an easy thing to ask." "I didn't do it for you," he said. Then, after a pause, softer, "I did it a little for you, mostly for him. He looked like he needed it more than either of us did." "You keep saying things like that. Like your part in this doesn't matter as much as everyone else's." Daniel considered that, hands in his jacket pockets, looking back toward the lit windows of the facility. "Maybe I just don't know how to be the reason for something this big," he said. "I fix light fixtures for a living, Miss Coulson." "Vivian," she said, "and you fixed my father's heart with your own 2 hands 12 years ago. I think you're allowed to be the reason for something." He didn't answer that, but he didn't argue it either, and they stood a while longer in the cool dark before finally saying goodnight. "Do you have someone from your own past you never got the chance to properly thank? Ask them before they become a photograph in somebody's drawer." In the weeks that followed, Vivian asked Daniel to sit on the advisory board of the company's new Employee Assistance Fund, not as a token gesture, not for the optics of it, but because she'd come to believe, watching him move easily among the line workers at the Ashland plant, that he understood something about dignity most of the executives in that building had never once had reason to learn. He said yes, on the condition that Ellie's school schedule always came first, and Vivian agreed without hesitation, understanding now exactly what mattered more than a quarterly report. Daniel began spending 2 afternoons a week at the plant, listening to line workers describe safety concerns they'd never felt comfortable raising through the usual channels, translating their language into the kind of engineering assessments the board couldn't easily dismiss. Vivian sat in on more of those meetings than her schedule strictly required, telling herself it was oversight, knowing somewhere underneath that it was something closer to wanting to be in the same room. One evening, after a long assessment walkthrough of the Ashland floor, Daniel offered to buy her coffee at the same diner where, 12 years earlier, he'd knelt on a linoleum floor and refused to let a stranger die. It was the first time either of them had suggested going anywhere together that wasn't official business, and both of them noticed it without saying so out loud. They sat in a booth by the window, and Daniel pointed out, without much ceremony, exactly where her father had been sitting that afternoon. Vivian looked at the spot a long moment, an ordinary square of floor tile that had somehow held the hinge of her entire life, without her ever knowing it was there. "Does it feel strange?" she asked, coming back here now. "Less than it used to," he said. "I used to avoid the place entirely. Now I think I like it better, knowing how the story ended up." She smiled at that, and he smiled back, easier than either of them had smiled at the other before, and neither one hurried to leave once the coffee went cold. "Can I ask you something?" she said, turning her mug slowly on the table. "Why didn't you ever try to reconnect with him afterward? My father, I mean. You had dinner once and then nothing. For 12 years. Daniel looked out the window a moment, at the parking lot, at nothing in particular. "He offered me things. That dinner. A job at the plant. An introduction to people who could have helped my career. I turned it all down. Felt like taking any of it would have made the whole thing transactional, like I'd saved him so I could cash it in later. Some things are worth doing just because they need doing. I didn't want that afternoon to turn into something else, even after everything happened. Even after Marie, especially after Marie," he said quietly. There wasn't room left in me for anything that felt like a favor being called in. I needed the one thing in my life that stayed plain and decent, with nothing attached to it. Vivian sat with that a while, understanding, for the first time, exactly how much restraint it had taken to be the kind of man who saved a stranger's life and then asked for nothing, not once, not even years later, when his own life fell apart and any reasonable person might have finally called in the debt. On a bright Saturday in early autumn, Colson Manufacturing held a small ceremony at the Ashland plant to formally name the new fund after Daniel, over his quiet objection that his name didn't need to be on anything at all. Folding chairs sat in rows on the factory floor among the idled machines, and workers who had known Walter Colson for 30 years wiped their eyes without embarrassment as Vivian spoke. "My father built this company on numbers," she told them, standing at a small podium with no notes in front of her. "Profit margins, safety records, quarterly targets. I used to think that was the whole story of who he was. It took a photograph I almost didn't find, and a man I almost never got to know, to show me the real story that everything he built after a certain November afternoon, he built because somebody gave him a second chance he never stopped trying to deserve. I'm not naming this fund after Daniel Reeves because he asked for it. He very specifically did not. I'm naming it after him because my father would have wanted his own name kept out of it entirely and put a stranger's name front and center instead. That was who he was becoming, at the end. I'd like this company to keep becoming that too." The applause that followed was unhurried, the kind that comes from people who mean it, rather than people simply waiting for the next item on an agenda. In the second row sat Walter Colson. In a wheelchair Rosalind had arranged to bring him in specially for the day, his good hand resting on the armrest, his eyes fixed on Daniel the entire time Vivian spoke. Ellie ran between the rows of chairs afterward, trailing a length of paper streamer, laughing with two of the workers' children like she'd known them her whole life, entirely unbothered by the size of the building or the weight of everything that had happened inside it to get her there. Someone from the local paper asked Vivian and Daniel to stand together beside the new plaque for a photograph, and they did, shoulder to shoulder, both smiling politely at the lens the way people do when they know a camera is watching. Rosalind, standing near the edge of the crowd with Ellie's hand in hers, caught the moment too, though from a different angle than the camera had, and said nothing about it to anyone, filing it away the same careful way she'd filed away every other quiet thing she'd witnessed in this family over the years. Later, driving home with the newspaper folded on the passenger seat, Vivian found herself glancing at it at every stoplight, at the accidental photograph nobody had meant to take, until she gave up pretending she wasn't looking and simply let herself look. But the photograph that ran in the paper the next morning wasn't the one the photographer had meant to take. It was the frame just before it, caught by accident when the shutter clicked a half-second early. Vivian's head turned slightly toward Daniel, Daniel's eyes already on her. Both of them caught mid-thought in a way neither had planned, and neither would have admitted to if asked. Neither of them had been looking.